Hi, welcome to Courageous Journeys. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks for joining me today. I've talked with you before about coping mechanisms, and I've talked with you many times about shame. Today, I'm bringing those two things together because it really plays such an important part in how we reaffirm what we believe about who we are and what's possible for our lives. So, I've shared before about 4 primary ways of coping, and today I'm going to talk about more specifically some things related to avoidance. Avoidance coping often is behavior based. We do things specifically to try to avoid. And I think a pretty common example of this is like addictive behavior. That is a form of avoidance. It's numbing, it's disconnecting, it's trying not to think about certain things. It's, having a glass of wine at the end of the day or a bottle of wine at the end of the day because your system is in overdrive. You don't want to think about certain things. And whether it's drugs or alcohol or shopping or sex or binging on Netflix for 2 days straight. So there are a lot of different ways that we can cope in those kinds of things or in addictive types of ways. But it doesn't have to be addictive behavior specifically. It can be a lot of ways that we do things, that we behave in certain ways, behaviors that we do that can help us avoid thinking or feeling. And that might be, like being a workaholic. It might be really, being really super hyper focused on certain things. But it's a way to kind of get your mind or your body focused on something else or to numb out completely so that you're not having to deal with these other things. And inevitably, almost anything that we do as a way of coping, we will find a way to feel bad about it. We'll feel shame, we'll feel guilt, we'll feel embarrassed, we'll feel weak. There are many ways that we can think about it that leave us ultimately feeling bad about who we are, which reinforces unworthiness, being undeserving, not good enough, not capable, being weak. So I wanted to talk about this in a particular way today. So I mentioned that it's really kind of problematic because it creates this cycle. We cope in a particular way, and often we're not necessarily even aware, certainly, that we're coping with anything, or even that we're really engaging in what that is until afterward. Sometimes it might be really in our awareness what we're doing, but sometimes it's not. And either way, we often end up feeling bad about it afterwards. So, for example, if I'm just trying to come up with something that would be pretty common for people. If we tend to avoid by even, let's say, binging on TV. So instead of doing the things that you need to get done, instead of doing the things even that you might want to do, you're feeling stressed out about something, you've become habituated to doing a particular thing, and you engage in that behavior. And then when the things don't get done that you wanted to get done, you feel bad about that. Maybe you feel guilty. Maybe you feel frustrated with yourself because you should know better. Maybe you even feel shame because you recognize that this is a pattern that you've tried to break and you really can't. Well, in order to cope with any of those feelings, it likely is going to drive you into another way of coping, maybe the same way of coping, or maybe a different way of coping that you then feel bad about. And each time you go through that cycle, you feel worse about yourself. You've reaffirmed with what you look at as evidence that you really are weak or undeserving, whatever it is. And it really becomes this horrible cycle that's really hard to break. And what people tend to do, which is logically, it makes sense. what people tend to do is focus on changing the behavior. Well, this is it's really challenging and sometimes impossible to do that, because our ways of coping are developed very early in life. We learn to avoid very early in life. Now, how we avoid in our adult lives, the behavior itself, might look a little different than what it looked like as a kid, because we have a lot more opportunity and experience and things available to us in our adult lives that we didn't have as a kid. But the avoidance mechanism, that way of coping, was developed very early on. And whatever way we cope, it's developed usually very early on. And as we're developing that, it becomes automatic. So we don't, as a kid, sit and think about, I'm feeling really stressed out right now, or what just happened to me was really traumatic and I need to figure out a way to cope with that. And then you decide that you're going to do something. No, you just do it. Your mind, your body has a way of knowing how to survive that, how to get through it. And really, that's quite amazing. I'm not going to go into a whole conversation about that, but truly, our ability as children, our brains aren't even fully developed, not even close to being fully developed. But as children, we have the capacity to figure out how to cope with, sometimes it's just the things that don't feel too good, or the incredibly traumatic things that we experience. But again, coming back, but it becomes this automatic response, right? So when we experience a stress in our lives, we automatically go into that way of coping. Rarely do we ever actually think about it. We just do it. Now, we may think about, oh, I really need a drink, or I can't wait to get home and sit in front of the TV for hours. Like, we might have that kind of thought, but we're not thinking about, oh, I'm feeling really stressed and I really want to find a way to cope. No, we just automatically respond. Very much the same way that if somebody throws a ball at your head really quickly, you're going to duck. You're not going to sit there and take time to contemplate, how should I respond to this ball coming at my head, and think of all the different options you have. No, you are going to instead duck, right? Automatically. Now, afterwards, you may be able to say, it was a Nerf ball, or it really wasn't coming towards me. It was actually coming over here and it never would have hit me. So afterwards, you might have the ability to think about it a little bit more clearly, but in that moment, you're just going to respond to it. It's not something you consciously think about. And the way that we develop our coping mechanisms and the way that they are ingrained are very much the same. It becomes kind of instinct. So when you focus on changing the way of coping, changing the behavior, it's like trying to tell yourself that you can just make a decision when a ball is coming at your head and it's right here, that you're just going to make a decision to stand there because you know it's not going to hit you at the end. Realistically, that's, just not very realistic, is it? That's not really going to happen. You have to train yourself. You have to have experience that shows you that that ball isn't going to hit you in order to be able to get to a place where you can just stand there. So when you focus on just changing the behavior, so, okay, I'm not going to go home and have a bottle of wine tonight. Instead, I'm going to meet up with some friends and have a nice conversation over a nice dinner, no alcohol. You might have that thought, and if you do, great. That's an important part of it. But if you're actually feeling really stressed, if something happens that creates a familiar feeling within you, you're likely going to tell yourself all the reasons that you shouldn't do that thing, that you shouldn't go out with your friends instead, and why it's better to just go home and have that bottle of wine. or work all night, or go to the gym and stay there for 4 hours, or go find somebody to have sex with. Like, there are a lot of ways this can look. Go home and obsessively clean every corner of your house. Go home and take drugs. I mean, there are so many different ways that we cope. And no matter what that is, we often end up feeling shame about it. And then when we focus on the behavior and we're not able to change it in those moments that we're really stressed, because in those moments, it's instinct. It's automatic. And then we feel bad afterward. We often take that as evidence that we're weak, that we're unworthy, we're undeserving, that you'll never be able to change it. And of course, that leaves you feeling shame. And like I said at the beginning, you often end up then doing something else that you don't feel good about. So what do we do instead? Well, first of all, being able to recognize that some of those things that you do that you feel bad about are actually ways of coping. That for whatever reason, you are coping with something that doesn't feel very good. And sometimes, this is an important thing, sometimes what doesn't feel good is actually a good thing. For example, somebody, you get a raise at work and everybody is like congratulating you. Like, that's a good thing, right? But that can actually leave you feeling really uneasy. You might even feel embarrassed because this attention is being paid to you. You might feel, it might bring up the idea that you're undeserving and you don't really deserve that raise. So even something that is actually quite positive can leave us feeling something that we need to cope with. So recognizing that you're feeling something that doesn't feel so good, something that's feeling stressful, uneasy, uncertain, maybe even shameful, embarrassing, and really just everyday kinds of stress can do it. So recognizing first that there is coping that's happening, whatever that coping looks like for you. And you may cope differently depending on the kind of stressor. So recognizing that there's coping happening is important. Then coming up with alternatives. Okay, well, if I'm feeling stressed out about this, then maybe I could do this instead. That's also helpful. What isn't helpful about that, going back to what I was saying a few moments ago, is that when you have the expectation like, okay, now I'm going to do this instead, and then you don't do that because it's not accessible to you in your mind at that moment of stress, you then beat yourself up about it. You then end up feeling shame about it. So that's not good. But contemplating, what are the things that I could do instead? What things are easily accessible to me? What are things that feel like I could do relatively easy without having to put a lot of energy or thought into it, without having to prepare to do it? So having an idea of what that can look like is also important. But one of the most important things is that when you engage in something, and this is true whether it's a coping mechanism or something else, but here we're talking about coping mechanisms right now. When you engage in a coping mechanism that you don't feel good about, instead of getting kind of caught up in the shame or the guilt or in the embarrassment, whatever it is, instead of getting caught up in that and judging yourself, beating yourself up about it, saying all those really harsh, mean things to yourself, meet it with compassion, with understanding, with grace. Just as you would somebody that you care about. If you had a friend who told you that they were feeling really embarrassed or really ashamed because they had a really kind of stressful day, or they were feeling really bad, but they didn't know why. And they got home that day and they just sat in front of the television and drank a bottle of wine. Would you berate them for that? Would you tell them, oh my God, what is wrong with you? You're so weak. Get your head together. Stop wallowing in this self-pity. You know better. You shouldn't have gone home and drank. You should have gone home and had a smoothie. Well, I'm guessing, feel pretty confident in saying this. No, of course not. You would never say those kinds of things to somebody that you care about who is sharing with you that they feel bad about this. Because you know that they already feel bad for one thing, and you know that that is not about who they are. You know that the ways that they're beating themselves up are not based in truth. You know that it doesn't mean that they're weak or undeserving. In fact, you'd likely offer compassion or support. You'd maybe even try to get them to share with you what's going on and what's creating that stress. But when it's you meet it with judgment. You're so critical that you should know better. And that creates this deep sense of shame that causes you to do more of that thing that you're already feeling shame around, or something different that you'll feel shame around. So when you meet that, going home and having a bottle of wine. Now, I want to be clear that something that is an addiction needs more than just self-compassion. Self-compassion is an important part, but an addiction is not something that you can change just through self-compassion. There's a lot of very specific and intentional work that needs to happen. But let's say you get home and you work until 4 o'clock in the morning and then you have to be at work at 6. But meeting that with, okay, what's going on? Why did I do that? Because there's a reason that you did it. Even if you don't know what it is, you may not have an answer, and that's okay. And that can be frustrating to people when you don't know why. But you don't have to know why. It's just about approaching it from a place of curiosity instead of judgment. So you could say to yourself, wow, I really stayed up way too late working. What was I trying to avoid? When you approach it that way, you create space for understanding and compassion. And in creating that space, you also then create the opportunity for things to begin to change. So when you say to yourself, instead of, what the hell's wrong with you? You know better than this. You do this all the time. You've done this to yourself. You have no right to be tired. If instead you can say, what was going on? Why did I come home and get so involved in work? What was I trying to avoid? Okay, I'll try to do better tonight. I'm going to try to make an intentional effort to make sure that I get more sleep tonight. But was there something that caused me to stress out? Was there something that didn't feel very good yesterday? And I'm not suggesting that you sit and try to analyze it for hours and stress out about trying to figure it out or needing to figure it out. You don't need to do that. Especially if you are seeing a therapist or something like that, because you can kind of figure it out together if that's necessary. But again, it's mostly because in approaching it from a place of curiosity, you're not approaching it from a place of judgment. So just as you would say certain things to your friend who's telling you that they just did that same thing, think about how you would think about that person, how you would approach that person, what you would say to that person. what you would want that person to feel instead of all the shame that they're feeling. When we can approach, whether it's a coping mechanism or anything else, any habit that we're in that we don't like, that doesn't benefit us in any way, and maybe even is kind of sabotaging to ourselves, when we can look at that from a place of self-compassion and understanding, what I mean by understanding is kind of making sense out of it instead of just judging it and labeling it as something. And grace. And what I mean by grace is maybe it is something to forgive yourself for. A lot of times I don't think that forgiveness is necessary for yourself, but maybe it is. Or maybe it's just acknowledging that you wish you hadn't done it and you're going to continue to work to do it differently. So even still maybe taking responsibility. So for example, if part of how you cope with things is to project onto other people, and in that projection, usually if we're projecting on other people, it's not in such a nice way. So in that situation, maybe you've done something that you don't feel good about, and maybe there's a valid reason that you don't feel good about it. But that doesn't mean that you should feel shame, because that's not going to be helpful. But you can feel regretful. You might feel remorseful. And if you don't go to shame, then you can feel that regret or remorse without it leading to shame. You can say to yourself, oh, wow, I really messed that up. And then from that place, because you're not going to shame, it takes practice to get there. But then you can actually make amends with that person. You can fully own how you showed up in that moment. And you can apologize if necessary for it, instead of projecting onto that person. So grace is often about, in this context, as I'm talking about it for me, grace is about, in a sense, kind of forgiveness and or understanding. It's understanding that there's some other things going on there. And while it may not be ideal, maybe even potentially kind of hurtful to somebody else, that you can accept responsibility for that, feel bad about it, but not hold on to shame around it. Because holding on to shame about anything is never going to push you in a direction that is healthy. It's not. And I know that there are people that talk about healthy shame, mental health people who talk about healthy shame. Part of it might be in how we define shame, but I don't think that shame is ever beneficial, because shame reinforces that deep core belief of not being enough or not being worthy. And as soon as that's touched upon, we're not able to make healthy, conscious choices, because we're just reacting to that shame. We're trying to not feel that shame. It's really hard to be conscious and make good choices when we're in a place of shame. And that's different than maybe feeling guilty about something or feeling regretful about something. In that place, if it doesn't go to shame, we can do things very differently. And so even going back to the idea of coping, if we're in the midst of something that's really kind of stressful and it's maybe over a couple of days, if we can become conscious that we're really struggling with something and not get sucked into that shame, which isn't easy to do. In fact, it can feel pretty impossible at times. But if we can be conscious enough and practiced enough to not do that, then we can make a conscious decision to choose something different. But it takes practice to get there. It takes the awareness that you're trying to cope in the first place. It takes compassion so that you can get out of that shame cycle. It takes practicing doing something different, because how we ultimately change the way that we cope is having those moments when we can actually do something different so that our nervous system recognizes that there's another way. We create a little bit of spaciousness in between the stress and the response. And over time, the more we get to practice this other thing, over time, that becomes our default. And so kind of just a quick example of how that can change is, for me, I used to not breathe very well at all. I would breathe very shallowly. I would hold my breath a lot. And through my healing experience and even learning more as a therapist, I found breathing to be a really important part of stress release and just connecting to my body. And I didn't really recognize that this was happening because it became a default. But just in the last few years even, my husband would point out to me, or actually ask me, what's wrong? And I was like, what do you mean what's wrong? Nothing was wrong. And he'll tell me that I had just sighed. I just like, and I was like, oh yeah, no, nothing's wrong. I was just breathing. But I realized, or I recognized, that that was happening automatically. Like if I was feeling maybe a little stressed and holding my breath, or if I just felt like I needed to calm a little bit, I would naturally just take a deep breath and sigh. So that didn't just happen. I didn't just make a choice to do that. That happened over probably literally years of intentionally taking deep breaths when I was feeling stressed. So it can happen, but it takes time and practice and lots of patience. Lots of patience, because every time you beat yourself up, you're furthering the idea, you're reinforcing that belief that there's something wrong with you, that you're bad, that you're undeserving. And focusing on self-compassion first, before you start expecting yourself to change the behavior, is ultimately how you change that way of coping. So, can you relate to any of this? So many people that I have worked with, pretty much everybody that I've worked with, has really struggled with shame around the ways that they've coped. Again, no matter how they've coped. And that's the thing about it, is it doesn't even have to be something that is perceived as bad. It can be things that are perceived by society as good ways of coping, like just, going home and cleaning your house from top to bottom. And sometimes, or in some ways, I suppose that's not a bad thing, except when it's because that's how you're coping. Because of course, then you're also not dealing with whatever it is that you're trying to cope with. So if you can relate, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, share your thoughts or experiences. If you've not yet subscribed to my channel, please do so, and be sure to click the little bell for notifications. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up. It really does help get the video seen by more people. And if you know somebody who might benefit from watching this, I'd really like to ask for you to share this with them. So thank you so much for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you soon. And before I forget, if you're interested in developing a deep sense of self-compassion, of practicing on a regular basis, building your capacity for self-compassion, then I'd like to invite you to check out my guided journal, Deeply Rooted. There's a link in the description below and a couple of testimonials. Deeply Rooted, it's cultivating self-compassion, self-acceptance, and healing. Thanks again for watching, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.